39 years ago, on March 15, 1970, Staff Sergeant Michael Dutch Harrison kissed his wife Sarah goodbye at their base housing in Da Nang, Vietnam. He told her he'd be back in 72 hours from what the Army called routine reconnaissance. Sarah never saw her husband alive again. Neither did the wives of the 7 other men who walked into the jungle that morning with Dutch's Recon unit Charlie 7. The disappearance of 8 highly trained soldiers plunged their families into a nightmare that would span 4 decades. Sarah Harrison, pregnant with their first child, watched as military officials offered conflicting explanations: desertion, capture, killed in action, missing in action. The constantly changing story devastated not only the families, but entire communities back home, in places like small-town Ohio, rural Kentucky, and suburban California, where these men had grown up dreaming of serving their country. The official investigation lasted 6 months before the case was quietly archived. The families were told that without bodies or credible intelligence, there was nothing more the military could do. But for Sarah Harrison, who gave birth to a son who would never meet his father, and for 7 other military wives, accepting silence was never an option. They formed an unlikely sisterhood, bound by grief and determination, fighting against a wall of military bureaucracy that seemed designed to forget their husbands ever existed. What made the disappearance even more haunting was the complete absence of witnesses. Recon Unit Charlie 7 had been inserted via helicopter into a remote sector designated Area of Operations Whiskey, along the volatile border between South Vietnam and Laos. Their mission, as later declassified documents would reveal, was to observe and report enemy movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They carried standard communication equipment and were scheduled for regular check-ins every 12 hours. The last radio contact came at 0900 hours on March 16th, when Dutch Harrison's voice crackled through the static. Charlie 7 to base, all quiet, continuing patrol as ordered. After that, only silence. When the unit failed to report at their scheduled 2100 hours check-in, rescue operations were launched. For 3 weeks, helicopters combed the jungle canopy, while ground teams pushed through terrain so dense that visibility was limited to mere yards. The search revealed disturbing signs: abandoned equipment, including Dutch's distinctive compass that Sarah had given him as a wedding gift, and scattered ration packs, but no bodies, no blood, no definitive evidence of what had happened to 8 men who seemed to have simply vanished into the green hell of the Southeast Asian jungle. As weeks turned to months and months to years, the official stance hardened into bureaucratic indifference. The men were classified as missing in action, a designation that provided their families with benefits but no closure. Sarah Harrison moved back to Ohio with her infant son Tommy, carrying the weight of unanswered questions. She would spend the next 39 years writing letters to congressmen, contacting veteran organizations, and refusing to accept that her husband's fate would remain forever unknown. The other families scattered across America, each carrying their own burden of uncertainty. Margaret Chen, whose husband, Sergeant David Chen, had joined the Army to support his elderly parents, never remarried. She dedicated her life to keeping her husband's memory alive, organizing annual memorial services, and maintaining correspondence with the other wives. Their shared determination became a quiet rebellion against official forgetfulness. What none of them knew in 1970 was that the truth lay buried in a remote valley, where 8 American soldiers had made their final stand against overwhelming odds, their sacrifice witnessed only by the jungle that would guard their secret for nearly 4 decades. Sarah Harrison's son, Tommy, grew up in a house filled with photographs of a father he would never remember. Every birthday, every school play, every milestone was marked by an empty chair and his mother's quiet tears. Sarah worked double shifts at the local diner in Portsmouth, Ohio, but her real job began when she came home, maintaining correspondence with military officials, veteran advocates, and anyone who might have information about Recon Unit Charlie 7. The Harrison household became an unofficial headquarters for what the 8 wives called the Circle. Every few months they would gather, sometimes in person, more often through lengthy phone calls, sharing any scraps of information they had gathered. Margaret Chen would report on her contacts with Asian American veteran groups. Patricia Kowalski, whose husband, Staff Sergeant Frank Kowalski, had been the unit's demolitions expert, maintained connections with explosive ordnance disposal veterans who might have served in the same region. Tommy Harrison learned to navigate around his mother's war room, a converted bedroom where Sarah kept files organized by year, correspondence sorted by agency, and a large map of Vietnam and Laos covered in red pins, marking every location where the unit might have operated. He understood even as a child that his father wasn't just missing, he was a ghost that haunted their entire family. The psychological toll on these families was immeasurable. Unlike families of soldiers confirmed killed in action, who could grieve and eventually find some measure of peace, the wives of Charlie 7 existed in a state of perpetual limbo. They couldn't mourn because there was always hope. They couldn't move forward because there was no closure. This ambiguous loss, as psychologists would later term it, created a unique form of trauma that would be passed down through generations. Margaret Chen never learned to drive, maintaining the same routines she had established when waiting for her husband's return from Vietnam. She kept his clothes pressed and hanging in their closet, his favorite coffee mug washed and ready on the kitchen counter. Her neighbors in San Francisco's Chinatown initially thought she was in denial, but Margaret's vigil was conscious and deliberate. "When David comes home," she would say, "everything will be exactly as he left it." The children of Charlie 7 grew up carrying their father's names and their mother's determination. Tommy Harrison excelled in school, driven by his mother's conviction that education was the key to eventually uncovering the truth. Patricia Kowalski's twin daughters, born 6 months after their father disappeared, became lawyers, inspired by their mother's decades-long battle against military bureaucracy. These weren't just personal tragedies, they were American tragedies. 8 families, scattered across a continent, united by their refusal to let their loved ones be forgotten. They organized bake sales to fund trips to Washington, D.C., where they would sit in congressional offices, presenting the same evidence and asking the same questions year after year. They wrote letters to every president from Nixon to Obama, receiving form letters in response that acknowledged their sacrifice but offered no new information. The wives aged, but their determination never wavered. Sarah's dark hair turned gray, then white, but she continued maintaining her files, updating her correspondence, and refusing to accept that her husband's fate would remain unknown forever. They survived on hope and stubbornness, 2 qualities that would eventually lead them to the truth they had sought for nearly 4 decades. By the 1990s, as the Vietnam War became historical memory rather than lived experience, the wives found themselves explaining not just their husband's disappearance, but the war itself to younger generations. They became unofficial historians, keepers of a story that the official record wanted to forget. Their persistence would eventually shame the military bureaucracy into action, but that triumph was still years away. What sustained them was their absolute conviction that their husbands had died honorably in service to their country, and that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge from the jungle that had swallowed 8 good men whole. The military's handling of the Charlie 7 disappearance revealed the dark machinery of institutional amnesia. Within the Pentagon's classified files, Recon Unit Charlie 7 existed in a bureaucratic gray zone, too secret to acknowledge publicly, too insignificant to warrant extensive resources for recovery. The unit's mission had been part of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group (SOG), conducting operations that officially didn't exist. Colonel James Weatherby, the commanding officer who had briefed Charlie 7 before their final mission, carried the weight of their disappearance for the rest of his military career. In classified debriefings, Weatherby described the unit as exemplary soldiers conducting essential reconnaissance in a hostile environment. But when speaking with the families, military protocol required him to offer only vague condolences and promises of ongoing investigation. The classified nature of SOG operations created a perfect storm of secrecy that worked against the families. Details about Charlie 7's specific mission, their exact insertion point, and even the identities of their helicopter crew remained buried in files marked with security classifications that wouldn't be declassified for decades. This wasn't mere bureaucratic inefficiency, it was systematic concealment designed to protect operational security at the expense of grieving families. Intelligence reports from 1970 and 1971 contained fragments of information that might have helped locate the missing soldiers. Radio intercepts suggested increased North Vietnamese Army activity in the region where Charlie 7 had vanished. Pilot reports mentioned seeing smoke columns and hearing distant gunfire in areas that matched the unit's last known position. But these reports remained scattered across different intelligence agencies, never synthesized into a coherent search strategy. The family's requests for information ran headlong into a classification system that treated every detail as potentially sensitive. Sarah Harrison's letters requesting copies of her husband's service records were met with heavily redacted documents that revealed nothing useful. When she asked for details about the search operation, she received form letters explaining that operational details remained classified for national security reasons. Colonel Weatherby retired in 1975, but the Charlie 7 case haunted him into civilian life. He began maintaining unofficial contact with some of the families, providing what guidance he could within the constraints of his oath of secrecy. Weatherby understood that these women deserved answers, but he also knew that revealing classified operational details could result in criminal charges against him. The bureaucratic obstacles were intentional and systematic. Military officials dealing with missing-in-action cases were trained to provide emotional support while revealing minimal operational information. The families were offered grief counseling, survivor benefits, and official condolences, but concrete details about what had happened to their husbands remained locked away in classified files. This institutional silence was particularly cruel because it suggested that the military possessed information it was choosing not to share. In reality, the classified files contained little more than the families already knew. 8 good soldiers had walked into the jungle and never returned. But the secrecy itself became a form of psychological torture, suggesting hidden knowledge that might somehow explain the unexplainable. Margaret Chen's persistence eventually caught the attention of a young congressional aide named Robert Martinez, whose own father had served in Vietnam. Martinez began quietly reviewing the Charlie 7 file, discovering that much of what remained classified consisted of procedural details that posed no current security threat. He began advocating for selective declassification, arguing that the families deserved access to non-sensitive information about their husband's final mission. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night. The breakthrough came in 1995, 25 years after the disappearance, when the Clinton administration launched a comprehensive review of Vietnam War-era missing-in-action cases. The review was prompted partly by normalization of relations with Vietnam, but also by pressure from families like the Circle, who had never stopped demanding answers. For the first time, military officials began sharing previously classified operational details with the families of missing soldiers. What emerged from the declassified files painted a picture of a unit that had walked into a carefully planned ambush. Intelligence reports suggested that North Vietnamese forces had been tracking American reconnaissance operations in the border region, setting traps for units exactly like Charlie 7. The soldiers hadn't disappeared mysteriously. They had almost certainly died fighting an enemy that outnumbered them by significant margins. But knowing how they had probably died was different from knowing where they had fallen. That answer would require another 14 years, and the discovery of bones that had been waiting patiently in a remote jungle valley for someone to find them and bring 8 American soldiers home. The Vietnam-Laos border region, where Charlie 7 disappeared, was a landscape of incredible beauty and lethal danger. Thick, triple-canopy jungle covered steep hillsides, creating a natural maze where visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. Ancient animal trails wound between massive trees whose roots formed natural bunkers and hiding places. This was terrain that favored defenders over attackers, locals over foreigners, and patience over aggression. By 1970, this border region had become a critical supply corridor for North Vietnamese forces moving men and materials into South Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American intelligence estimated that thousands of enemy soldiers passed through the area monthly, but the dense jungle made precise tracking impossible. Units like Charlie 7 were inserted to observe and report, providing the eyes on ground that satellite surveillance couldn't deliver. The members of Recon Unit Charlie 7 were all volunteers for special operations, soldiers who had chosen the most dangerous assignments the Army offered. Staff Sergeant Michael Harrison, the unit leader, had already completed 1 tour in Vietnam before volunteering for reconnaissance duty. Sergeant David Chen spoke fluent Vietnamese and served as the unit's interpreter. Staff Sergeant Frank Kowalski was an explosives expert who had trained other soldiers in improvised explosive device disposal. The other 5 members of the unit represented the cream of American military personnel. Specialist Robert Bear Mitchell, a radio operator from rural Montana who could maintain communications under the most adverse conditions. Corporal James Sullivan, a medic from Boston whose father had served in World War II. Private First Class Anthony Rodriguez, a machine gunner from Texas whose accuracy with heavy weapons was legendary among his peers. Specialist William Billy Anderson, a scout from Oregon whose ability to read jungle terrain had saved other units from ambush, and Private First Class Michael Foster, the youngest member of the unit at 19, whose sharp eyes and steady nerves made him an excellent point man. These weren't simply 8 soldiers who happened to be assigned together. They were a carefully selected team whose individual skills complemented each other. Harrison's leadership experience balanced Chen's linguistic abilities. Kowalski's technical expertise supported Mitchell's communication skills. Each man brought specific capabilities that made the unit more effective as a whole. Their final mission briefing took place at Firebase Alpha, a heavily fortified position about 30 kilometers from the Laosian border. Colonel Weatherby personally conducted the briefing, emphasizing the importance of observation over engagement. "Your job," he told the 8 soldiers, "is to watch and report. You are not there to fight, unless fighting is the only way to survive. Intelligence suggests significant enemy activity in your area of operations, which is exactly why we need eyes on the ground." The unit was equipped with state-of-the-art communications gear, including backup radio systems and emergency beacons. Each soldier carried enough rations for 5 days, standard infantry weapons, and specialized equipment suited to their roles. Harrison carried detailed topographical maps and a compass, the same compass his wife had given him as a wedding gift, engraved with the words, "Always find your way home." Their insertion point was designated Landing Zone Whiskey, a small clearing about 2 kilometers from the Laotian border. The helicopter insertion was conducted at dawn, when morning mist provided natural concealment. The last confirmed sighting of Charlie 7 was from the helicopter crew, who reported seeing the 8 soldiers disappearing into the jungle tree line, moving in standard patrol formation with Billy Foster on point and Bear Mitchell bringing up the rear. For the first 24 hours, everything proceeded according to plan. The unit established a concealed observation post overlooking a known enemy supply route and began their surveillance mission. Their scheduled radio checks were conducted on time and reported no enemy contact. Harrison's reports described normal jungle sounds and animal activity, suggesting that their presence hadn't been detected. The terrain where Charlie 7 operated was honeycombed with caves and natural concealment positions that had been used by various armies for centuries. French colonial forces had fought in these same valleys during the First Indochina War. Viet Minh guerrillas had used the jungle's natural advantages to defeat technologically superior opponents. By 1970, North Vietnamese forces had decades of experience fighting foreign armies in exactly this type of terrain. What Charlie 7 couldn't know was that their insertion had been observed by enemy scouts positioned along likely helicopter approach routes. North Vietnamese intelligence had identified American reconnaissance patterns and developed countermeasures specifically designed to capture or eliminate small units operating alone in border regions. The jungle that Charlie 7 thought provided concealment was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. Local farmers who worked in the region would later recall hearing distant gunfire around March 17, 1970, sustained automatic weapons fire, followed by several explosions that echoed through the valleys. But in a war zone where distant gunfire was commonplace, these sounds attracted little attention at the time. It would be nearly 4 decades before anyone understood that those echoes had marked the final battle of Recon Unit Charlie 7. The immediate search operation for Charlie 7 involved every available resource in the region. Within hours of their missed radio check, Colonel Weatherby launched what would become one of the most extensive missing unit searches of the Vietnam War. Helicopter crews flew grid patterns over the dense jungle, their rotor noise echoing off valley walls as door gunners scanned the canopy below for any sign of the missing soldiers. Ground teams pushed into the border region from multiple directions, but the terrain that had made Charlie 7's mission necessary also made rescue operations nearly impossible. Soldiers equipped with machetes could advance only a few hundred yards per hour through jungle so thick that maps became irrelevant. The same triple canopy forest that concealed enemy supply routes now hid any traces of the missing reconnaissance unit. Captain Robert Hayes led the primary ground search team, a reinforced platoon of volunteers who understood they were looking for fellow soldiers in hostile territory. Hayes had served with Michael Harrison on a previous deployment and took the search personally. His team found scattered evidence of Charlie 7's presence: empty ration containers, discarded ammunition, and most significantly, Harrison's compass, found beside a stream about 3 kilometers from their last reported position. The discovery of the compass created more questions than answers. The engraving was clearly visible: "Always find your way home," but there was no other equipment nearby, no signs of struggle, and no indication of what had happened to the man who had carried it. Hayes carefully preserved the compass, hoping it might provide forensic evidence, but 1970-era battlefield investigation techniques were primitive compared to later scientific methods. Search helicopters flew increasingly dangerous missions, hovering just above the jungle canopy, while crew members rappelled down to investigate anything that might be wreckage or human remains. Several helicopters took ground fire during these operations, and one crew was forced to make an emergency landing after their aircraft was hit by enemy small arms fire. The intensity of the defensive response suggested that North Vietnamese forces were actively protecting something in the region. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, Colonel Weatherby faced an agonizing decision. The search operation was consuming enormous resources and exposing dozens of American soldiers to enemy fire. Intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese reinforcements were moving into the area, drawn by the sustained American presence. Continuing the search risked additional casualties without significantly improving the chances of finding Charlie 7 alive. The decision to suspend active search operations was made at the highest levels of American command in Vietnam, but it fell to Colonel Weatherby to inform the families. His letters to 8 military wives were among the most difficult documents he ever composed, explaining that everything humanly possible had been done to locate their husbands, but that continued searching would endanger other American lives without reasonable hope of success. Sarah Harrison received her letter on April 15, 1970, exactly 1 month after her husband's disappearance. The formal language couldn't mask the underlying message: the Army was giving up. But Sarah and the other wives of Charlie 7 weren't ready to accept defeat. If the military couldn't find their husbands, they would continue the search themselves, using whatever resources and connections they could develop. The wives began corresponding with other families of missing soldiers, sharing information and strategies for pressuring military bureaucracy. They learned to navigate the complex classification system that governed information about special operations, discovering that persistence and political pressure could sometimes unlock details that routine requests couldn't obtain. Margaret Chen became expert at writing letters to congressional representatives, while Patricia Kowalski developed contacts within veteran organizations. Over the years, the families funded several private search expeditions to Vietnam, working with veteran groups and private investigators who specialized in missing in action cases. These expeditions were hampered by diplomatic restrictions, language barriers, and the simple reality that the jungle had reclaimed most traces of the war. But they kept the case alive in media attention and political consciousness. The breakthrough finally came from an unexpected source. In 1995, during President Clinton's normalization of relations with Vietnam, the Vietnamese government began cooperating more extensively with American efforts to locate missing soldiers. Vietnamese officials provided access to military archives and facilitated joint search operations in previously restricted border regions. A joint American-Vietnamese team returned to the area where Charlie 7 had disappeared, using 1990s technology and Vietnamese local knowledge to search terrain that had been inaccessible to American forces in 1970. They found additional evidence of the unit's presence: corroded equipment, fragmented personal items, and military gear that had somehow survived 25 years in the jungle environment. But still, no human remains. The jungle had guarded its secrets well, concealing 8 American soldiers in terrain so remote and hostile that even the most sophisticated search techniques couldn't penetrate its mysteries. The wives of Charlie 7 continued their vigil, now supported by their adult children and a growing network of advocates who refused to let the case be forgotten. It would take another 14 years, and the accidental discovery by local farmers, before the final chapter of Charlie 7's story could be written. If this case has already gripped you, hit that like button. It helps the story of Charlie 7 reach more people. By the 1990s, the border region between Vietnam and Laos had transformed from an active war zone into a remote farming area. Local families had moved into valleys that once echoed with gunfire, establishing small agricultural communities in terrain that had been too dangerous for civilian settlement during the war. These farmers knew the jungle held secrets, unexploded ordnance, abandoned equipment, and occasionally human remains from various conflicts that had raged through the region. Nguyen Van Duc was 63 years old in 2009 when he decided to expand his cassava fields into a previously unused section of his family's land. The terrain was challenging, a narrow valley surrounded by steep hillsides covered in secondary jungle growth, but the soil appeared fertile and the location was convenient to his existing irrigation system. Van Duc had been farming in the border region for over 2 decades and was accustomed to finding remnants of the war buried in his fields. The discovery happened on a humid morning in July 2009. Van Duc's son was operating a small tractor, preparing the soil for planting, when the plow struck something that clearly wasn't stone or root. Investigation revealed fragments of corroded metal and what appeared to be deteriorated fabric. Van Duc, who had found unexploded ordnance before, approached carefully. But what he uncovered wasn't a bomb. It was a human ribcage, partially covered by the remnants of what had once been a military uniform. Vietnamese authorities were contacted immediately. The local police understood that discovering human remains in a former war zone required careful handling, both from investigative and diplomatic perspectives. Within days, a joint Vietnamese-American team arrived to conduct a proper archaeological excavation of the site. What they found would finally answer questions that had haunted 8 American families for nearly 4 decades. The excavation revealed the remains of 8 individuals, arranged in what appeared to be a defensive fighting position. Military equipment scattered around the site included corroded weapons, fragments of radio gear, and personal items that had somehow survived 40 years in the tropical environment. Most significantly, military identification tags were found with several sets of remains, providing definitive proof that these were the missing members of Recon Unit Charlie 7. Dr. Sarah Kim, the American forensic anthropologist who led the identification process, described the site as a time capsule of courage. The positioning of the remains suggested that the soldiers had died defending a small hilltop position, probably after being surrounded by superior enemy forces. Evidence of defensive preparations, including what appeared to be hastily constructed fighting positions, indicated that Charlie 7 had attempted to hold their ground rather than attempting to escape through the jungle. The forensic evidence told a story of a unit that had fought with professional skill against overwhelming odds. Ballistic analysis of recovered ammunition indicated that the soldiers had maintained fire discipline even under extreme pressure, conserving ammunition and concentrating their fire on the most dangerous threats. The positioning of the remains suggested that they had continued fighting even after suffering casualties, with surviving unit members moving to cover wounded comrades. Michael Harrison's remains were found in what appeared to be a command position, surrounded by the remnants of radio equipment and map cases. His wife's compass was discovered nearby, its metal surface corroded, but the engraving still faintly visible. David Chen's remains were found beside what had been Vietnamese language documents, suggesting he had been attempting to gather intelligence even during the final battle. Frank Kowalski's position was marked by fragments of explosive devices, indicating he had used his demolitions expertise to defend the unit's position. The Vietnamese farmers who had discovered the site were honored by both Vietnamese and American officials for their respectful handling of the remains and their immediate notification of authorities. Nguyen Van Duc, who had unknowingly farmed around the grave of 8 American soldiers for years, expressed profound respect for the men who had died so far from home. His family participated in the repatriation ceremony, understanding that they had been guardians of a sacred site without knowing it. DNA analysis confirmed the identities of all 8 soldiers, providing conclusive evidence that would finally allow their families to achieve closure. The remains were carefully prepared for repatriation to the United States, where they would receive full military honors and burial in their home communities. After 40 years of uncertainty, the wives of Charlie 7 would finally be able to grieve properly for husbands they had never stopped loving. The archaeological evidence supported what military officials had long suspected. Charlie 7 had died in combat, probably during a coordinated enemy ambush that had trapped the unit in terrain that favored the attacking force. They hadn't deserted, hadn't been captured, and hadn't died from accident or disease. They had died as soldiers, fighting for each other and their mission until the very end. The discovery would bring justice to 8 families who had never stopped believing in their loved ones' honor, but it would also reveal the incredible courage of soldiers who had faced impossible odds with unwavering professionalism. The forensic identification of Charlie 7's remains represented one of the most comprehensive missing-in-action recovery operations in American military history. The Joint POW-MIA Accounting Agency deployed a full scientific team to process the discovery site and conduct detailed analysis of every fragment of evidence recovered from the Vietnamese jungle. Dr. Sarah Kim arrived at the excavation site within 48 hours of notification, accompanied by a team of specialists in forensic anthropology, archaeology, and military history. Their first priority was documenting the site exactly as it had been found, using GPS coordinates, photographic mapping, and careful cataloging of every artifact recovered from the location. The position of human remains and military equipment would provide crucial evidence about what had happened during Charlie 7's final battle. The forensic analysis revealed details that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. All 8 soldiers had died from combat injuries, probably during a sustained firefight that had lasted several hours. The positioning of their remains indicated they had maintained unit discipline even under extreme pressure, with soldiers covering each other and attempting to evacuate wounded comrades to more defensive positions. Military historians who examined the site concluded that Charlie 7 had been caught in a carefully planned ambush, probably by a North Vietnamese army unit that had been tracking American reconnaissance operations in the border region. The enemy had allowed the Americans to establish their observation post, then surrounded them with superior numbers and firepower. The terrain favored the attacking force, leaving Charlie 7 with limited options for escape or reinforcement. The DNA identification process required coordination with families who had been waiting 40 years for this moment. Sarah Harrison, now 73 years old, provided DNA samples that would definitively identify her husband's remains. She made the trip to the military laboratory, accompanied by her son Tommy, who was finally going to meet his father, even under these tragic circumstances. Margaret Chen had prepared for this possibility for decades, maintaining medical records and family genealogical information that would facilitate identification. At 78, she had outlived many of her contemporaries, but had never wavered in her conviction that her husband would eventually be found. The confirmation that David Chen's remains had been identified brought her a sense of completion that she had been seeking for 4 decades. The scientific analysis also provided insights into the soldiers' final hours that honored their courage and professionalism. Evidence suggested that Charlie 7 had detected the ambush and attempted to fight their way out of the trap, but had been prevented from escaping by the terrain and the number of enemy forces surrounding them. They had chosen to make their stand on defensible ground rather than attempting to flee through jungle that would have exposed them to pursuit. Personal effects recovered from the site included corroded dog tags, fragments of wallets and photographs, and military equipment that had been standard issue for special operations units in 1970. Michael Harrison's compass, found near his remains, would be returned to Sarah as a tangible connection to her husband's final mission. Each family would receive personal items that had somehow survived 4 decades in the jungle, physical links to husbands and fathers they had lost so long ago. The forensic team's report concluded that Charlie 7 had died with honor, fighting against superior odds and maintaining their mission objectives until the end. Evidence suggested they had continued attempting to radio for assistance even during the final phases of the battle, indicating they had not abandoned hope of survival or rescue. These were soldiers who had done everything their training and their courage allowed, dying in service to their country in a remote jungle valley that would guard their secret for nearly 40 years. The identification process also revealed the remarkable preservation of evidence in the jungle environment. While organic materials had largely decomposed, metal objects and fragments of synthetic materials had survived sufficiently to provide detailed forensic information. The site had been undisturbed since 1970, creating what archaeologists described as a snapshot of the unit's final battle. For the families, the scientific confirmation brought both closure and renewed grief. After 40 years of hoping their loved ones might somehow still be alive, they now faced the definitive reality of their deaths. But that reality also brought dignity to men who had been whispered about as possible deserters or casualties of unknown circumstances. The forensic evidence proved conclusively that these 8 soldiers had died as heroes, fighting for each other and their mission against impossible odds. The repatriation ceremony would honor not only the soldiers who had died, but the families who had never stopped believing in them. The repatriation ceremony at Dover Air Force Base on September 15, 2009, marked the end of the longest missing-in-action case in Vietnam War history. 8 flag-draped coffins emerged from the cargo hold of a military transport aircraft, each containing the remains of a soldier who had been missing for 39 years, 4 months, and 31 days. For the families gathered on the tarmac, this was simultaneously the funeral they had never been able to hold and the homecoming they had never stopped hoping for. Sarah Harrison, supported by her son Tommy and daughter-in-law Rebecca, watched as her husband's coffin was carried by an honor guard whose members had not even been born when Michael Harrison disappeared in the Vietnamese jungle. The ceremony was conducted with full military honors, acknowledging not only the soldiers who had died, but the families who had endured decades of uncertainty without losing faith in their loved one's honor. Margaret Chen, now 80, had flown from San Francisco accompanied by a niece and 2 members of her local veteran support group. She had waited 4 decades for this moment, maintaining her vigil through years when other people suggested she should move on or accept reality. Her reality had always included David's eventual return, and now he was finally home, ready for the burial she had planned and replanned countless times over 4 decades of waiting. The ceremony included representatives from the highest levels of American government, acknowledging that the recovery of Charlie 7 represented more than a successful forensic operation. It was a national commitment fulfilled. The military's promise to leave no soldier behind had taken nearly 40 years to honor in this case, but it had ultimately been kept through the persistence of families and the dedication of specialists who had never stopped searching. Colonel James Weatherby, now 85 years old and confined to a wheelchair, had made the trip from his retirement home in Florida to witness the return of soldiers he had sent on their final mission. His presence at the ceremony represented both military honor and personal redemption. The commanding officer, who had carried guilt for 4 decades, was finally able to welcome his men home and witness the respect they deserved. Each family received their soldiers' remains along with personal effects that had been recovered from the jungle site. Sarah Harrison was presented with her husband's corroded compass, the wedding gift that had somehow survived 4 decades in tropical conditions. The engraving was barely visible, but the words "always find your way home" seemed prophetic. Michael Harrison had finally found his way back to the woman who had never stopped loving him. The military's investigation had concluded that Charlie 7 died honorably in combat, fighting against superior enemy forces in terrain that offered no possibility of escape or reinforcement. This official determination meant that all 8 soldiers would receive posthumous commendations, recognizing their courage and dedication. Their deaths were no longer mysterious disappearances. They were combat casualties who had served with distinction in their country's most difficult war. Tommy Harrison, meeting his father for the first time, struggled with emotions he couldn't fully articulate. At 39 years old, he was older than his father had been when he died, but he had spent his entire life shaped by Michael Harrison's absence. The funeral would provide closure to a loss that had defined his family's entire existence, but it would also mark the beginning of a new relationship with a father he would know only through stories and memories. The individual funeral services were conducted in the soldiers' home communities, where local residents who barely remembered the Vietnam War gathered to honor men who had become legends in their absence. Michael Harrison was buried in Portsmouth, Ohio, where Sarah had maintained his gravesite for nearly 4 decades, adding his name to a headstone that had waited patiently for his return. David Chen's funeral in San Francisco drew hundreds of mourners from the city's Asian American veteran community, honoring a soldier whose linguistic skills and cultural bridge building had made him invaluable to his unit. Margaret Chen, finally able to say goodbye properly, placed his wedding ring, which she had worn on a chain around her neck for 40 years, in his coffin before burial. Frank Kowalski was laid to rest in Detroit, where his twin daughters, now successful attorneys, delivered eulogies for a father they had never known, but whose sacrifice had inspired their careers in public service. Patricia Kowalski, who had spent decades fighting military bureaucracy, found peace in knowing that her husband's courage had finally been officially recognized. The other 5 soldiers received similar honors in their home communities. Bear Mitchell in Montana, where his family ranch had been maintained as a memorial, James Sullivan in Boston, where his father's World War II veteran friends formed an honor guard, Anthony Rodriguez in San Antonio, where the local Hispanic community claimed him as a hero whose sacrifice bridged cultural and generational divides, Billy Anderson in Portland, where environmental groups honored his love of the outdoors that had made him an exceptional scout, and Michael Foster in rural Kentucky, where his high school retiring his jersey number in posthumous recognition. The reunification of Charlie 7 in death brought healing to families who had spent 4 decades in limbo. The wives, now elderly women who had outlived their husbands by 40 years, could finally grieve properly and begin the process of emotional closure that had been impossible while their loved ones' fates remained unknown. But the impact extended far beyond 8 families. The Charlie 7 case became a symbol of military commitment to recovering missing personnel, regardless of how much time had passed or how difficult the circumstances. It demonstrated that the promise to leave no soldier behind wasn't merely a slogan. It was a sacred commitment that would be honored even decades after a conflict had ended. The Vietnamese farmers who had discovered the remains were invited to attend memorial services, honored as the guardians who had protected sacred ground without knowing its significance. Their respectful treatment of the site and immediate notification of authorities had made the recovery possible, representing the healing that could occur between former enemies united by respect for the fallen. The return of Recon Unit Charlie 7 marked more than the end of a 40-year mystery. It represented a transformation in how America honors its missing warriors and supports their families. The case became a template for missing in action recovery operations, demonstrating that persistence, scientific advancement, and international cooperation could solve even the most challenging disappearances from America's most controversial war. Sarah Harrison lived until 2015, 6 years after her husband's return, finally able to spend her remaining time as a widow rather than a woman whose husband's fate remained unknown. She used those years to establish a scholarship fund for children of military families, ensuring that Michael Harrison's sacrifice would continue benefiting others long after his story ended. Tommy Harrison, now a successful engineer, became an advocate for military families dealing with missing in action cases, understanding from personal experience the unique trauma of ambiguous loss. Margaret Chen passed away in 2018 at the age of 87, having achieved the closure she had sought for nearly 5 decades. Her final years were spent organizing cultural exchanges between American and Vietnamese veteran groups, building bridges between former enemies through shared respect for military service and sacrifice. Her home, which had been maintained as a shrine to her missing husband, became a gathering place for military families dealing with similar losses. The scientific techniques developed during the Charlie 7 identification process revolutionized missing-in-action recovery operations. DNA analysis methods that had been experimental in 2009 became standard procedures for identifying remains from conflicts dating back to World War II. The careful archaeological documentation of the jungle site created protocols that were applied to recovery operations in other countries and conflicts. The case also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in resolving wartime missing-in-action cases. The Vietnamese government's assistance in locating and recovering Charlie 7 demonstrated that former enemies could work together to honor the fallen from both sides. Similar cooperation programs were established with other countries where American service members remained missing from various conflicts. Colonel James Weatherby died in 2012, having witnessed the return of the soldiers he had sent on their final mission. His final years were spent working with military historians to document the lessons learned from special operations in Vietnam, ensuring that future commanders would understand both the capabilities and limitations of small unit reconnaissance missions. His personal papers, donated to the Army War College, included detailed analysis of the Charlie 7 case that would inform military doctrine for decades. The 8 soldiers of Charlie 7 were posthumously awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device, recognizing their courage in maintaining their mission despite being surrounded by superior enemy forces. Their final battle was studied at military academies as an example of small unit leadership under extreme circumstances, demonstrating how training, courage, and unit cohesion could enable soldiers to fight effectively even when facing impossible odds. The family's 4-decade struggle against military bureaucracy led to reforms in how the Department of Defense handles missing in action cases. New protocols required regular communication with families, systematic review of classified information for declassification potential, and coordination between different agencies working on recovery operations. The Charlie 7 wives' determination had not only brought their husbands home, it had improved the system for future military families facing similar circumstances. The jungle site where Charlie 7 made their final stand became a place of pilgrimage for American veterans visiting Vietnam. The Vietnamese government established a small memorial at the location, honoring both the American soldiers who died there and the local farmers who had protected their remains through decades of unknowing guardianship. The memorial's inscription, in both English and Vietnamese, reads, "Here lie 8 American soldiers who died with honor, far from home but not forgotten by those who loved them." Educational programs developed around the Charlie 7 story teach students about the human cost of war, the importance of persistence in seeking truth, and the healing that can occur when former enemies work together to honor the fallen. The case demonstrates that individual courage, whether displayed by soldiers in combat or families seeking answers, can create positive change that extends far beyond personal circumstances. The weapons and equipment recovered from the site were preserved in military museums, serving as tangible reminders of the soldiers who had carried them into their final battle. Michael Harrison's compass, restored and displayed alongside his Medal of Honor, bears witness to a promise kept. After 40 years lost in the jungle, he had finally found his way home to the woman who never stopped believing he would return. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Recon Unit Charlie 7. We'll see you in the next video. The story of Charlie 7 proves that love transcends death, that truth ultimately emerges from even the deepest shadows, and that the commitment to leave no soldier behind isn't just a military slogan. It's a sacred promise that will be kept regardless of how long it takes or how difficult the circumstances. 8 soldiers who walked into the jungle in 1970 came home in 2009, carried by the unwavering faith of families who never stopped believing in their honor and the dedication of specialists who never stopped searching for the truth. Their legacy lives on in military families who understand that service to country sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice, and in the knowledge that those who make that sacrifice will never be forgotten, never be abandoned, and will always eventually find their way home. Today, Michael Harrison's compass sits in a place of honor at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., its corroded surface bearing witness to a love that transcended 4 decades of uncertainty. The engraving, "Always Find Your Way Home," has become a symbol not just for Charlie 7, but for all the families who refuse to let their missing loved ones be forgotten. Sarah Harrison's final interview, recorded just months before her death in 2015, captured the essence of what the Charlie 7 story represents. "People ask me if I'm bitter about the 40 years of waiting," she said, her voice steady despite her advanced age. "But I'm not. Those years taught me that love doesn't have an expiration date, and that truth doesn't disappear, just because it's buried in a jungle halfway around the world." The Vietnamese farmer, Nguyen Van Duc, still tends his fields around the memorial site. He has become an unofficial guardian of the location, ensuring that visitors understand the significance of the ground they're walking on. His family has maintained the memorial through seasonal changes and political transitions, understanding that they are custodians of sacred ground that belongs to both nations. The children of Charlie 7, now adults with families of their own, carry forward their father's legacy through military service, public advocacy, and community leadership. Tommy Harrison became a military chaplain, counseling families of deployed soldiers and understanding their fears from personal experience. The Kowalski twins established a legal clinic, specializing in military family issues. Using their professional skills, to fight the same bureaucratic battles their mother had waged for 4 decades. In classrooms across America, teachers used the Charlie 7 story to illustrate lessons about perseverance, sacrifice, and the power of unwavering love. Students learn that heroes aren't just the soldiers who died in a distant jungle. They're also the families who never stopped believing in them, who fought impossible battles against bureaucratic indifference and won through sheer determination. The jungle that once concealed 8 American soldiers has been reclaimed by local communities, but it has not forgotten the men who died there. Villagers speak of early morning mist that sometimes takes the shape of walking figures, and of evening winds that carry sounds like distant radio chatter. Whether these are supernatural manifestations or simply the power of human imagination, they serve as reminders that some places are forever changed by the courage of those who fell defending them. Military academies around the world study the Charlie 7 case, not just as an example of small unit tactics under extreme pressure, but as a demonstration of how institutional failures can be overcome by individual persistence. The wives who refused to accept official silence became a force that ultimately reformed how military bureaucracies handle missing in action cases, creating systems that are more responsive to family needs and more committed to recovery operations. The story of Recon Unit Charlie 7 proves that some promises transcend death itself. 8 soldiers walked into the jungle in 1970 with a mission to serve their country. They completed that mission with their lives, but their real mission, returning home to the families who loved them, took 4 decades to accomplish. It required the dedication of wives who became warriors in their own right, the persistence of specialists who never stopped searching, and the cooperation of former enemies who understood that honoring the dead serves the living. In the end, Michael Harrison's compass did exactly what Sarah had engraved it to do. It found its way home. Not immediately, not easily, but inevitably, because some loves are too strong to be defeated by time, distance, or even death itself. The 8 soldiers of Charlie 7 teach us that heroism isn't measured only in moments of combat, but in decades of faithfulness, years of hope, and the unwavering conviction that those we love are never truly lost, as long as someone remembers their names and refuses to let their stories end in silence. Their legacy whispers through the jungle where they fell and echoes in the hearts of families they never met, but somehow saved through their example. No one is forgotten. No one is abandoned. Everyone eventually finds their way home. The compass points true even after 40 years. Love is the magnetic force that guides us through the darkest forests, and faith is the path that leads us back to those we thought we'd lost forever.